Economic relief is on the way for millions of Americans struggling from the effects of the pandemic. Congress passed a $900 billion package late last night, and President Trump is expected to sign it. The bill includes money for renters, food assistance, child care, unemployment benefits, stimulus checks, and more. So Nancy Cordes is following the latest on Capitol Hill and joins us now. Nancy, it's actually sort of the second round of relief. The problem is that it's been many months since Congress has revisited this, and it's desperately needed. And so here we are. I think it's like 6,000 pages, so I know there's a lot in there. I'm sure you went through all 6,000 pages.
Oh yeah, I've
we've
got
been
it right
talking
here,
a lot
Anne-Marie.
over the.
Still paging through it.
We've been talking a lot, actually, over the past few weeks about extending federal unemployment benefits, about eviction moratoriums that were on the verge of expiring. These are the sort of things that, can make a difference right away. People don't have to wait for a check. Something like this can mean you can at least breathe a sigh of relief. When can people expect to receive those individual stimulus checks, though, and how long is this supposed to last?
So amazingly, the Treasury Secretary says that some of the first checks are going to start going out next week. So that means the first people could start getting their checks between Christmas and New Year's. He hasn't said how many of those checks will actually go out that quickly, but certainly they learned a few things, streamlined the process from the first time around in the spring when they sent out $1,200 per person. This time around, it is $600 per individual making less than $75,000 a year, or a couple that makes less than $150,000 a year, they'd get $1,200. And just doing the math, because each kid gets another $600. If you have a family of 4, that means $2,400. Family of 5, $3,000. Democrats wanted more. They wanted to do a repeat of the checks that we saw in the spring for $1,200. But the fact that these stimulus checks have made it into this final relief package at all is pretty notable, because they really weren't on the table for weeks and weeks. Both sides decided that they were too expensive to go into this compromise package that was going to be about $900 billion. But at the end of the day, they made a swap. They took out funding for state and local governments, because that was very controversial with Republicans, and put these stimulus checks back in. And that's why so many Americans are going to start seeing those checks either directly into their account or in the mail.
Here's the thing, even with the $1,200 in the CARES Act, that was widely criticized as just not being enough, especially when you kind of could look around the world and see the way other countries were supplementing the income of people who were really hurting from this pandemic. So you've been talking to people you've talked to people on the verge of being kicked out of their homes. You've talked to people who are struggling to figure out a way to buy food. What do they make of this package? Is it enough?
Well, look, every little bit counts, but certainly if you have been out of work for 9 or 10 months at this point, $600 is a drop in the bucket. I've interviewed a number of people who lost their jobs who live in Florida. Unemployment maxes out in Florida at $275 a week. So let's say you were somebody who was making $75,000 a year and you were living a $75,000 a year lifestyle. Suddenly you're getting $275 a week. That may not even cover your rent, let alone all the other expenses you have in your life, your car payment, your utility bills, your Wi-Fi, your food, your water, just the basics. And so $600 might contribute to 1 month's rent, but for people who are now maybe half a year behind in rent, it is a really deep hole to try to dig out of.
So we mentioned that the bill is 6,000 pages long. Clearly, what we've discussed thus far does not take 6,000 pages to explain, so there's probably an awful lot of other stuff in that bill. Did lawmakers even know exactly what they were voting on?
They knew the broad strokes. They had all gotten the outlines, just like we did, of breakdowns of how much money is going to food assistance, how much money is going to schools, how much money is going to vaccine delivery, and so on and so forth. But obviously, they would normally like to spend a little more time perusing such an enormous piece of legislation than they were able to spend this time around. Partly it was because, Congress really wanted to get out the door. door, both to get home for the holidays, but also because every day that they stick around here means that they are traveling home during a pandemic that is getting worse and worse. That's a pretty risky proposition in and of itself. So yes, there are some extraneous things in this bill and the companion bill that was passed last night, this big omnibus government spending bill that basically funds the government into 2021. There are things like tax deductions for business lunches. That's something that caught a lot of people's eyes. There are also provisions to create new Smithsonian museums for women and for Latinos. There are provisions that have to do with making some illegal streaming a felony. So no, a lot of this doesn't have anything to do with pandemic relief, but this is a pretty common phenomenon that we see this time of year on Capitol Hill as Congress is racing to get out of town. The legislative session is almost over, and so they sort of throw everything into one basket. Everything that needs to get passed goes into one must-pass piece of legislation, and it's about passing it now and asking questions later.
Yeah, that is how the sausage is made, as they say. Nancy, thank you so much.
You're welcome.